Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 91st New Social Environment. My name is Catherine, and I have the absolute pleasure of being your MC today for a conversation between Suzanne Blier and Coco Fusco. We're also thrilled to have the poet Corrine Fitzpatrick here, who will read to end today's event. And now to introduce today's host. Coco Fusco is an artist and writer based in New York. Her work has been in the Venice Biennale, Basel Unlimited, Frieze Special Projects, and 2 Whitney Biennials, among many others. She's a professor at Cooper Union School of Art and a contributor of The Rail. Our guest today, Suzanne Blier, is an art historian and professor of fine arts and of African and African American studies at Harvard. She's a member of the Institute for Quantitative Social Science and a faculty associate at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. Her work focuses on African art, architecture, and culture. Welcome both, and Coco, I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, well, hi everybody. Thanks for tuning in the middle of this unbelievably hot day. But I am really honored to be here today with Suzanne Blier. I found the book about Les Demoiselles d'Avignon absolutely fascinating. It reads like the finest scholarship, but also like a thrilling work of detective fiction. And so I'm very happy and very excited to have the opportunity to ask you some questions about your research and about the book. So I'm going to start by asking you to describe in a more general overview way the focus of the book and how you think that your argument changes the understanding that many of us have that comes from received knowledge of Picasso's Demoiselles painting. Particularly in relationship to how people understand the representation of women. The traditional reading of the work is that it is the representation of a scene in a brothel. So I'm wondering if you can summarize for people listening today.
Well, thank you, Coco, and it's so wonderful to be here in this wonderful forum. Let me begin by saying I had no intention of writing this book at all. It's pretty far from the sorts of things I usually do, but I was in the library doing a bit of research and came upon a book I'd read many years before and started leafing through it and found what I realized then were the sources for, at least the sketches for Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avignon. And I thought that was interesting. I'd seen some of this discussion at the Museum of Modern Art exhibit on primitivism in 20th century art, and it kind of made me rethink that. But I wasn't going to do anything more with it, except that over the course of the next 4 or 5 years, I found 3 other books that I began to realize he likely had seen at this time. And at that point, the gods just came down on me and said, look, there's something calling you in this painting with these 5 amazing demoiselles, and you have to do it. So it's very rare for a scholar to find that kind of a beginning to a project. And by the end of it, I realized that it really does call on us to rethink a whole number of critical issues, from the importance of race in the development of modernism more generally. I think it really calls on us to rethink this particular painting, which has had, over the years, some very strong, really powerful scholarship about it, that in the end, I think it's somewhat turned on its head because of the concrete evidence that I've been able to show. But it is an iconic work. It's probably one of the most famous anywhere. And I think it, just as I'd mentioned at the outset about these 5 women who finally said to me, look, you have no choice but to write this, I really tried to keep them in the forefront throughout of, well, what are you asking me to say about you? What are you asking me to say about the painter who did this amazing work? And how does it transform what we understand about the painting and also what we understand about this particular period and the artist himself.
Could I press you just a little more to talk about the representation of women specifically? Because I think that you sort of take us out of a certain paradigm that had, you know, the female figures in the painting associated with illicit sexuality, the bordello, etc. And then your vision of them is in some ways, well, obviously it's more global, but it's also more sort of mythological and spiritual in some ways. And I think that that has to do with how you connect them with sculpture. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I will say some people have said this is a feminist read, and it may be. I think as an author, one doesn't necessarily have a particular single read that one is bringing to it. But one of the things, I mean, just imagine in your mind that you're standing at MoMA in front of this remarkable work. You have facing you 5 women, or they are in the canvas. You have the 2 women on the right. You've got a crouching figure who's turned, facing away from us, turning towards us, looking us directly in the eye. Somebody often identified as African with that unusual, strange nose that people can't quite figure out. And standing in profile directly above her is a figure identified as an African. On the far left is a woman walking in profile towards the other side of the canvas in a kind of sarong-like thin attire, often identified as an Egyptian or a Southern Asian woman. And then in the middle are 2 European women in kind of Greco-Roman attire. And the painting itself, in part following up on one of the early titles that was given to this by somebody in Picasso's circle, and that title being Le Bordel Philosophique, the philosophical brothel, so to speak, led many scholars to see this as an actual physical brothel, and that these 5 women were there as prostitutes. This is the principal argument that art historian Leo Steinberg has brought to it. And that what makes this painting so powerful is that it's speaking to a male John, a male client who's come into the brothel and sees these women and is about to select between them, and yet he finds himself facing these women with their eyes staring back at him. And so some of the discussion has been about that. But I think the key thing is, in French, le bordel does not mean a brothel. It means a complex situation. It means something that's very difficult, very messy. You know, a mother would tell her daughter, your room, ça c'est un bordel, your room is a real mess. And so here we have it right in front of us. And so it doesn't really make much sense of it as a physical brothel. First of all, since when do you have an Egyptian woman walking in profile, an Egyptian manner, you know, across the front of a brothel? And in fact, I think Picasso was really interested in some of the core intellectual issues of the day, including evolution, including ideas of theosophy, which were prominent then, but thinking more broadly about the colonial era in which he was living, and the fact that all of a sudden the world is indeed truly global, and the interest in art is truly global. And I think it gives a very different read. I would say at this juncture, before my book, many people had sort of given up on the painting and on Picasso, of seeing him as, in many respects, a misogynist, in the painting of these 5 women as speaking to that very misogyny. In fact, he had a relatively stable relationship with his former model during this period. And I think these women play much stronger roles in the painting and really speak to us in very different ways about the humanity more generally of women around the world. And what makes it, to me, I think, most shocking is that he painted each of these 5 women in the styles of the artistic representations that these areas, these geographical areas, were known for at the time. And so whether it's ancient or whether it's any number of other periods, I think that that contradiction between these perspectives and these art forms is in part what makes it so powerful. So if I could just say one more word while this is up, it was long assumed that all the women were intended to be European, Caucasians in essence, as suggested by the sketch on the right. But one of the things that I found out was that really from the time you began applying paint to the canvas, the two women on the right were intended to be resonant of either African or some kind of primordial culture. So that also, I think, is an important addition to our understanding of the painting.
Thank you very much. I'd like your approach in the book, I find also really, really strong and illuminating, because you combine a tremendous amount of historical research that you've done on where Picasso was when using photographs to be able to date the creation of the painting, looking at what was going on at the time, what people were reading, what was popular, how many copies of this particular book sold. And so there's a tremendous amount of historical and sociological information on the one hand, and then on the other hand, there's a very, very careful formal reading that is, I think, what enables you to graft certain influences from sculpture and from illustrations of sculpture onto exactly what Picasso ended up with in the painting itself. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you arrived at that kind of bifurcated methodology and what you think it offers.
I'm so glad you asked that question. It's really terrific, and I haven't really thought about that larger issue except to say I'm an Africanist, and the book that immediately preceded this was a book on an ancient site in Nigeria dated to around 1300. These stunning bronzes from Ile-Ife, a Yoruba center, and I wrote this large book on these amazing sculptures without a single written source. And so how does one do that? You really look closely at the objects. I spent a lot of time walking around to the various sites where they were found, interviewing families who were owning these particular shrines. And as an Africanist, I think that you really learn how to overturn stones, to kind of look at where things are, because there's an awful lot within the art itself and within the society that is there for us to understand if we only take the time to look. So the disadvantage of jumping into a book on Picasso, much less Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, as a scholarship is very strong. It's wonderful, whether we're talking about Leo Steinberg or Rosalind Krauss or Eva Lambois or others. And I could not really offer much new there, but I did want to try to put myself as much into the world that Picasso was living at that time. Walking around to all of the places, all the haunts, going to the nightclub where he went, the Lapin Argile, just trying to get as much as I could from it. And to really work on this in a way that I was trying as much as I could to unturn every stone possible. And I think through that very process, we often forget as art historians, we come at things by either the archive, right? Or by way of theorizing, just wonderfully exuberant or profound text about a particular work. And we overlook how important it is to actually look at a painting. I think this is one of the most looked at paintings, but I was pretty stunned at how few people have actually seen it, even though one has looked at it. You know, I'll say to people, well, what did you find in the painting? They say, it was scary. And I'm going like, tell me how. And all the women are staring at me. And you look at the painting and no, that's not true. You know, the woman in the foreground is staring back, but the others are not. Or they'll say they're naked, right? And I'm going like, well, 2 of them are, but 3 of them aren't. And
also, I mean, 75% of Western art has naked women in it. So I can't see why that would frighten anybody.
Well, there we go, right? So, and you've got a lot of staring women. We can think about Manet and many others as well. So, yeah, I think You know, again, I really tried to have the painting speak to me. And when I decided on a particular narrative style, it is, I think, theoretically important, but it's also, as much as anything, an ethnography, a travel of discovery so that people can follow in my footsteps if they want and discover it with the same kind of pleasure. I mean, it was a real mystery for me as I was going forward and trying to discover, you know, well, when was this actually painted? You know, it had not been finalized, I think, until this book. I mean, it's been identified as having been done nearly half a year later. And I think that kind of excitement of discovery hopefully will inspire other people to take on some of these classics and rethink them, but in a new light, bringing back into play issues of race, issues of women. I mean, women are sex objects, so are men. But if you're going to have sex, one of the issues within that context is the potentiality for becoming a parent. So this particular painting, I've argued it's as much about motherhood. It's about the whole process of sex. And I think that that is something which also helps to enrich it. And that gets to one of the real complicated things about Picasso in this period, where as profoundly innovative as he was deeply afraid about parenting. And if he would have a child, would that mean the end of his creative power? And it was a dilemma, I think, that he was engaged with through much of his career. And I can't say that he's the only one that has felt that. You know, I certainly felt that when I decided to have a child and I was an academic. I was thinking, well, you know, what will happen? And it's something that I think all of us, in one way or another, whether we decide to have children or not to have children, address. But here we have the 5 great mothers, I'm arguing, of the world's races, in essence. Not that a race is a singular thing. And that very nature of bringing these different women of different races together in the same room is itself radical. You know, just that proximity of positioning would not have been done this way, I think, without the insight of Picasso. And I think it's a massive canvas. I mean, you see it at MoMA. I mean, as he is painting it, he really is looking into the eyes of the woman who is crouching in the lower right. It is probably as big as he could fit into that studio. I don't know how he thought anybody was going to buy it. I mean, where can you, Gertrude Stein certainly couldn't put it in her apartment, but he wanted a big canvas because it was a great big idea, and his whole career rested on it, and he really wanted to transform art, Western art certainly, but I think global art more generally.
Well, what you're saying just now makes me think, again, back to some of the chapters of your book where you talk about the relationship that he had with these ethnographic photography and this sort of pseudoscientific studies, that in those volumes, there was an attempt to kind of bring together all the races. I wonder if you're sort of suggesting that it was through exposure to that kind of taxonomic vision that he was able to envision a painting that represented all of the peoples of the world.
Yeah, exactly. And particularly this one author who was German from Austria and had compiled these books that went through multiple editions with masses of photographs that just kept getting bigger and bigger and larger. And I think they were incredibly important. They went through so many editions, and they were read the same book by, in some cases, the same people as in a different kind of audience way. On the one hand, this was an era, it's hard to imagine now, when you wouldn't see women's necks or wrists or legs. Even a doctor did not get to see women that he was treating, much less men. So by having most of these images as women without their clothing on was pretty transformative. And so on the one hand, there was a scientific base to it, and he was a medical doctor. He's identified today as the first gynecologist, believe it or not. So there's that piece. This is a time when photography, of course, is readily available. And for Picasso, it's the end pretty much of using a physical model, a woman who's going to sit there for hours and hours and hours in front of him. And it's painful for the models, and it's, you know, expensive and sort of painful for him. And so these books were intended in part for artists. They had every conceivable pose portrayed of the classic works. And of course, they were pornography. And so you could readily imagine some man or possibly a woman opening them up and doing what one does when one looks at pornography. To my mind, what makes these books particularly egregious, though, is that the women were positioned in so-called evolutionary order. And so it begins with the so-called primordial, the primitive, then goes to African, Native American, Southern Asian, North African, Southern Europe, Northern Europe, and it ends in Denmark. And so when you combine that scientific thread with the art thread, with the sexual thread, and put that in the hands of so many people in this time period, I think that's where a lot of these really horrific ideas about race and difference and hierarchy really begins to take shape within the minds of way too many people. And I can't help but think of some of the worst parts of the Nazi era and eugenics that in part are growing out of this kind of combination of these threads within the way one as a viewer looks at these particular books.
Agreed, although I think that racial thinking and hierarchical classification of peoples goes back to at least the 18th century, if not more. I mean, and it becomes a more sort of pseudoscientific discourse that supplanted a more mythological and biblically derived one. So I think you're right that it's the advent of not only photography, but the technologies of mass reproduction of photography that allow these images to proliferate in postcards and magazines and books that generalizes this knowledge and also cements a relationship between the photographic image as evidence of the theory, because it had relied prior to that on scientific illustration, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's also got this educational role, much like, you know, the zoos that you have brought into play in such a provocative way. I think that idea that it's entertainment and that it's education, you can see these people quote unquote live, I think that adds yet another dimension to this that to some degree I think was of interest to Picasso. He'd been to the Exposition Universelle in 1900 and would have seen the Dahomey women warriors, the Amazons, while he was there. And I should say not the Amazons, they weren't at that one, but certainly the Dahomeans and other groups. And so as part of the European sort of mythos, probably until, I mean, you still find these taking place in various sites, unfortunately. But it was supposed to give realism to the animals and a sense of all of these other people, I guess, are so close to nature that they're readily involved with the zoos, the natural zoos of the world, which
yeah, and they were all. I mean, there were trophies. The ethnographic displays were like war trophies, but in many senses, they were also kind of how to put it, spectacles designed to legitimate colonial expansion. So you mentioned the Exposition Universelle of 1900. There was one in 1889, also in Paris, that Gauguin visited the Tahiti pavilion and then got the idea to go to Tahiti. And that pavilion was basically set up because the French had just colonized the Tahiti, and they were kind of saying, look, this is all the things that we have that we can show you from Tahiti. Come to Tahiti, right? Set up business in Tahiti. So there was a bit of that going on as well, the business dimension of this. I want to go back to the book and to how your approach, in a sense, cracks open a way of thinking about the painting and about Picasso's endeavor that had been shut down by certain kinds of analytical resistances. You talk about a resistance to, in prior literature and art history on Picasso's work, to addressing African influence in anything other than a matter of strict formal affinity, like his shape is like this shape. And also you talk about a certain kind of unease in among art historians in recognizing the role of ethnographic photography. And I'm trying to remember exactly why you see that resistance existing, if it's because of using photography versus models, or if it's because of the photographs are sort of, as you say, they're borderline pornographic. So I'm wondering if you can talk about those kinds of resistances. I found that argument very interesting, very illuminating.
Great. Well, let me begin with the latter. Of course,
Okay.
Picasso was not the first to use photographic sources. Matisse was using some of the same ones, Gauguin, many others. But I think up until maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, to have admitted as an artist, as a great artist, that this is where you were taking your ideas was viewed as problematic. And I think that's in part what gave a sense of nervousness to Picasso himself. When he was asked repeatedly by MoMA's director, Alfred Barr, among others, well, where did you get your sources? And, you know, he would give one or another answer. So I think that there is this thing about artists and the kind of viable sources they should be using, I think, that played a role in it. I think he would have been perfectly happy if it was simply the soft porn. I mean, he could have cared less about that, I would say. I think the greater thing that you put your finger on directly is when you have somebody like Picasso, who's identified as the founding artist for much of what we identify with modernism in the 20th century, whether you're talking about Cubism, which I also think even in this painting and the works leading up to it, he was already very close to coming up with the key principles that define Cubism. But when we remove that from Picasso and say it was Braque and Picasso, or when we kind of insist that Picasso really didn't need African art for this kind of intervention, engagement, I think it is because of this great fear we have. How can a whole century of art, how can a brilliant artist such as Picasso, whose influence was so great, have derived his critical ideas from Africa? And it sort of cuts both ways that make it important but difficult to discuss. You'll find a number of African artists and others still to this day who really are upset with Picasso for having stolen African art and re-engaged it. And they'll put this in the same light with the British stealing the famous Benin bronzes in 1897. You and I both know that artists take ideas from many places. You're not necessarily able to foreclose on what you're looking at, but it is it opens up a deep wound, I think, in various ways that people have a hard time addressing, much like the issue of Picasso and women. And in some ways, I think what's kind of interesting to me is looking at not all of this happened at the time of his death or soon afterwards, but I think when Picasso died in 1973, it really opened up the possibilities for a lot of people to engage with some of his ideas in ways that they might not have wanted to before, because he was such a profoundly important figure.
Okay, thank you. Can you give, for those of us who may not be so familiar with just how African artifacts, sculptures, masks, and other objects and works of art, how they enter both the Western European context at the time that Picasso was working, and how they become, sort of how they arrive at artist studios? Because you have scenes in your book in which you describe Picasso at a gathering at so-and-so's house with a sculpture in his hand. This other artist's collection of this. I have all these pictures of, different studios, not just of Cubist, but also the famous pictures of Andre Breton's studio with all the Kachina dolls on the wall. In other words, how did these artifacts find their way to these people and these contexts?
So there were a lot of ways. You had the scientific travels to collect in places like the Congo. And the Germans were among those who were doing it. And Frobenius, the book with the African masks, was in essence the beneficiary of those early collections. Scientific, in quotes, to bring back culture, but that in a way was also to denude these populations of their cultural heritage so that the missionary drive could be more successful. So you have that piece, and then you had various people who were part of, whether it was missions or whether it was military officers or administrators, who would go to Africa and come back with objects. So the specific work that you're talking about, which was a Congo figure that was owned by Matisse, to my mind, it's a really interesting figure in its own right. But I think what makes it so profoundly interesting to me is the way that Picasso looked at it. He certainly was using his eyes, but that whole evening to read about it, where he was just grappling with it with his hands, feeling the concavities and the convexities and the way the body was shaped, you realize, or I realized that, you know, as an artist, he was really learning in so many different ways. And I think for him, sculpture was critical, but we as a Western audience have been late to appreciate the sculptures, except for the recent, relatively recent MoMA show. But I think that that piece was really, that intimacy was incredibly important for him. And the next morning, his friends go to his studio, and strewn across the floor, they say, were these images of one-eyed women. Very different from what he'd done before. Having found some of those, you can see the progression. They're not all that different, but you can see he's focused on a few details like the ear in ways that he might not have done before. And then what fascinated me was he did go to the Trocadero Museum, which various people identify as important for him, but he didn't go to see African art or oceanic art. He went to see medieval art, the casts of medieval art, because at that time in France, medieval art was primitive art. And they were on a kind of restitution trip in Paris to revitalize the view of French national art, which was medieval. But at this time period, medieval and African and oceanic and Native American were in a certain sense in the same boat, waiting there for discovery, rediscovery. And once you've got photography and once you've got such profoundly interesting traditions within realism, there's not much further that you can go within that context. And so I think that, you know, the challenge of going beyond photography, going beyond realism, and then having the richness of whether it's medieval or African materials that really force one to rethink human form, the nature of the image, and even, you know, superimposing onto that various values of religion or otherwise. You know, when you hold one of these figures that one senses is old, you can feel it in a way. You know, you're superimposing onto it, but there is that kind of added sense of power, I think, that becomes part of it.
I've seen photographs of the Musée du Trocadero from 1905, 1906. It's a mess. The artifacts are piled on top of each other on tables. There's no labeling. There's no classification. I'm not even sure if artifacts were associated with particular countries or regions. I'm curious to know, from your perspective, first of all, how did these artists engage with this stuff that was basically, to me, it looks like it's being treated like junk. Like, how do you go in and start to make sense? And then also, how does it come into their hands? Because you describe artifacts that are actually in the possession of individuals. So in your last response, you talk about how the artifacts leave Africa, but then they don't go directly from the missionaries into Matisse's hands. So what is it? What can you take us through those steps to understand?
Yeah, and by way of a preface, I would say that Africans were also taking from European tradition. So you have European saints, et cetera. So it's a really interesting two-way street. But you do have the military encounters where they collect everything they can and bring it back. And those things got put in what was then the Trocadero Museum. And so you would have to see them there, although, you know, there were two objects that were stolen from the Louvre that ended up in the hands of one of Picasso's friends. They were from Spain, but you had those kinds of things happening. But and then you have scientific expositions, you've got administrators, but there was somebody not far from where Gertrude Stein lived called Père Sauvage, who had a small, I know.
Wild father?
Yeah, who had a small store with selling various things, and he had a number of Dahomey works, among other things. And these are brightly colored, and you probably know that Apollinaire referred to Picasso as l'oiseau du Benin, the bird of Benin, because of a Dahomey work, it was called From the Bite of Benin, that he had owned. And so there were people who were selling these things that came in. I don't know, imagine you're a administrator, you send to your family one of these works, or you come back and your spouse says, you're not going to put that in here with the children, honey. And so you bring it down, and so that's how they got sold. And there were a number of people who were collecting them in this time. Derain certainly was, and Picasso was, and a few others, but at the time he painted Les Demoiselles d'Avignon in what was in essence one night, if you can imagine it. He did not actually own any of the African or oceanic works. He bought them later, I think more as mementos of the very process that he was involved with.
Something begins at that time that we still live with. And I think you're right about the back and forth of influence, but also I think that it is the awareness of a market for these things that has generated the production of copies, fakes, derivatives, fake artifacts, everything from the burial dolls in Peru that used to be part of Inca graves that now are, people make new ones and then bury them for a while to make them look aged and then sell them to you as if they're from some pre-Columbian grave. And it's not just from Africa, it's all over the world that I've seen this phenomenon, how to put it, it's on a kind of industrial scale now. Even if you stand outside MoMA and there's usually guys selling all these copies of African sculptures on the street, right? So I think that probably the relationship during Picasso's period was more one of newness, but at this point it's become almost a kind of stock and trade belief that these are fetish objects that carry some kind of magical power or whatever. But it's interesting to me that they arrive at it with a certain kind of freshness and curiosity, even though they're in an intellectual climate that would be kind of conditioning everybody to think of the peoples that produce the works as inferior.
Right. And just let me just add quickly, I don't want to lose sight of the fact of how radical he was in just insisting that these were artworks. Medieval art wasn't even an artwork, but to say that African artworks, they make sense to me, they are profoundly important, was to say that Africans were human. They had civilization. They were engaging in really important ideas. And that was radical because you can't get involved in slavery or colonialization without imagining these other people to be less than we are. And so by that very fact, and even MoMA at the beginning was profoundly different, with Alfred Barr, they had some of the very first and important African art exhibits, pre-Columbian as well. And then I think it's, in the 50s where a lot of that important sense of where these objects are coming from gets taken away from the corpus as modernism then is being reshaped away from it.
So, but this is sort of off the subject, but do you think that Barr's perspective is a standard or that he was anomalous In other words, from your understanding of the kind of the literature of the period, do you think that Barr's wanting to exhibit African art was something that was the norm, or was he an outstanding contestatory figure in his time?
Well, there were several others who were doing it as well. We can think about the Barnes Foundation, which had started early, but thanks in part to Picasso. But I think, and we have to, it's not just Alfred Barr, but he taught one of the very first courses here on African and Oceanic art. We have to add in Abby Rockefeller and the Rockefellers' interest in this kind of issue, and their works are now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but they had founded a museum. So I think it was radical in their acceptance of the idea of Picasso and others, that these really were important artworks in their own right. So I think it's important to bear that in mind, because as much now with the renovation of MoMA and going back and rethinking this, it's not like it's so new. It was here before, and we're rediscovering it and hopefully adding to it. What Barr did that I think was problematic was to simply say Les Demoiselles is a painting on the road to something else. And Picasso absolutely hated that. It's a painting on the road to Cubism. Because he said no painter is going to, you know, create a canvas that isn't something in its own right, that's on its way to something else that I don't know what it is, right? So.
Okay. Can we shift a little bit our attention back to the question of ethnographic photography? You know, 20 years ago, I was curating an exhibition about the history of racial representation in American photography. And I am not a scholar of photography. So a lot of my research was discovery for me. And one of the things that really struck me was that basically in the sort of last 20, 30 years of the 19th century, the technology of photographic reproduction made possible the mass dissemination of images for the first time. And that mass dissemination included an enormous amount of depictions that were ethnographic and also racist caricature. I was focusing more on racist caricature, but when I would go to these collections, I would find boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes of stereo views and postcards that were depictions of quote unquote others, non-Europeans, right? In various, and the poses were often, you know, sort of standardized, right? So that you could tell that even if the photographs were being reproduced for commercial purposes, the starting point is these kind of paradigms that are derived from either phrenology, right? Or from anthropology and ethnography. I was stunned, and it really made me think about Victorians as much more curious about others than I had thought before. And I, you know, I think you don't talk about that specifically, but I think that you're bringing in the role that ethnographic imagery played in the development of Les Demoiselles speaks to this larger phenomenon of people in Europe being very curious about others and that they were coming into view, right? Now, obviously, you could say that the way that they were looked at was exploitative. You could say that the science that was being put forward was very racist. But there's something else there, which is a very strong desire to see others. And also the nakedness of the other in these photographs, as you say, you know, was kind of an unusual opportunity, right? It's framed obviously with all sorts of ethnocentric ideas about their proclivities and their sexualities, but nonetheless, it's there, right? So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about your, how to put it, your insistence in a way in your argument on taking taking the relationship that the artist had to the photographs more seriously than it had been taken before.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you're really touching on, again, something critically important. And I think the photograph is not a simple two-dimensional form by any means. I mean, we know this and can enrich and complicate this in many ways. And I think on the one hand, as you point out, and this is in part deriving from this, you talk about it from the vantage point of phrenology, but it's also from the vantage point of this idea that there is a science to race, that if you have frontal photographs and you have profile photographs, whether you actually have calipers and can go around the world and measure people, or whether you simply do that from the background of a photograph in those two positions, it was part of that idea of, in some way, dividing the world up into different taxonomies. It's like Saussure in linguistics, right? This was a time when all of these various languages were being studied and looked at from the vantage point of grammar and the relationship of one to another. I think one of the, ironic is not the right word, but I think one of the complicating things about the photographs is, and you can see it when you have them in contexts where there's a long caption, like for example, after the 1893 Chicago Columbian Exposition where Dahomians were on view, they humanize people. And so for the, you look at these and at a certain point, you realize everybody's pretty much the same. You've got different proportions and et cetera. But in an era where you really are trying to dehumanize certain people and transform others in a particular way, one does see that for the most part, the Europeans in these are more modestly positioned in a way to show that somehow their sexuality, they're conscious of it, whereas the idea in places like Africa, maybe they're not so conscious of it, or at least not so prohibited from expressing it. But the captions in the Chicago context were like, don't be fooled. Look at this photograph and you'll see these people, but these are very dangerous people and don't get too close because, and I think that that's one of the things that's interesting about photography. It can be endearing. It can be something that brings one together. And in a sense, Straut's volumes do serve that purpose, but they're also deeply problematic because like any album, right? The order, the indexicality of it, of how one photograph is positioned in relationship to another becomes, another thing altogether. The other thing that I find interesting in this is that for the most part, they're only looking at women. Right. There are a couple of contexts in which they do have male nudes, but then they blur the genitalia. And it goes to this fear of, oh my God, if we show male nudes, then we'll be accused of promoting homosexuality or something. But somehow the woman, it's like thinking about conquering lands as kind of virgin land, just the term that, so they're there for the taking.
There's also, it's also true though that in the colonial photographic representations of indigenous people in the South Pacific, that there are photographic representations of men, not as many as there are women, but part of, I think that may have something to do with there being a lot of speculation about homosexuality being commonly practiced in a lot of the indigenous South Pacific cultures. And that, and also this sort of fascination with third gender peoples from that region of the world, that you see a lot of depictions of biological males coming from there. I wonder, in the argument from the 80s within the colonial harem, if I remember correctly, because it's been a long time since I read that book, but I think that the author was suggesting that one of the reasons why there were so many women and, that there were women and not men was because the photographers were going into houses of quote unquote ill repute. So they had access to the women that way. Those were the only women in Algeria at the time who would have allowed themselves to be photographed without being covered. So and he puts that in as a kind of explanation. I don't know if that's also the case in other contexts.
So I think in sub-Saharan Africa, it's a very different thing. It's the way that certainly they might have had a bit more clothing on, but it's right. The way that people moved around. So I think it's very different, but also there's a real power dynamic. so that when a colonial officer is coming in to a village and can take away the men to build a road or do whatever, and they say, we want to take a photograph of the women and have them disrobe, it's very difficult to say no. So you've got that, and sometimes you can see this sense of either anger or fear of expression in their faces. So I think it's probably different in different contexts. And there are also some of these women who are living in Europe. There's one great case of a German woman. I'm not sure where she's from, but she's identified in different photographs as a Zulu woman, put in Zulu attire. But there were Africans and others who for a long period of time have been living in Europe, and then they might get paid for some of these roles as well.
Okay, I'm seeing notes about, we're getting to the Q&A soon, so I'm going to try to combine the last two questions I had for you, which really have to do with putting your analysis in a broader context of questions that are being asked these days about decolonization and the art world and art institutions, and I think is specifically in relationship to your work would be in relationship to art history. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about two things. One is about the role of the kind of analysis that you engage in a process of decolonizing the field, and also what would you say about the importance of still, returning to European masters in an era in which some are thinking that perhaps they take up too much space, right? They have all the attention in the canon, they have all the space in the museums, they have all the, I deal with students, for example, who say that they don't want to know about Europeans anymore because they are in a process of decolonization. So I'm wondering if you could address those two things to wrap up.
So I think on the one hand, it's important we all move out of our fields. In this case, as I say, it wasn't volitional. I was called in a funny way by those books showing up. But I think that we've put too many boundaries between our fields. Say you're a modernist or you're a Renaissance scholar. And the field should be open, because I think we're going to each be able to bring something to that in interesting ways. I also think there's some really great research being done now. Just re-looking at earlier works or rediscovering ones that were never on view, that reading them from a new way of looking is going to allow us to understand, for example, in Northern Renaissance painting or Northern Baroque painting, all of these cabinets with imagery of things that had come from Africa, and then looking at the ship documents to see, well, where were they coming from and who else was coming with them. There's a whole new world that I think can be explored that is really important to do so. And I don't want any museum, either in Africa or in the West, to be denuded of the objects of the other. I think that that's really important, that our students get to see some African art here, and that students in Benin get to see some European art. I think that there are ways in which we've got plenty of art in both places. We can make that happen. I think what we don't have, and I really want to encourage who's ever listening, the field of art history is an incredibly rich one. You learn how to read, to see, to explore. I feel just incredibly lucky to be in it. We need many more people of far greater diversity to come into it. And that's where we're struggling to meet the needs of museums, to meet the needs of academies, et cetera. And I think that's where, in our focus on STEM or in our focus on whatever it is, we lose track of the fact that there are an awful lot of great positions and a lot of new insights that for the next generation, if we can get a much broader group of students going into it, that we would all be great beneficiaries of it.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Do we need to go to Q&A?
Yeah, this is a good time to move to Q&A if you guys are ready. We have some really great questions in the chat, and I just want to thank you, Coco, for leading this really insightful conversation, and Suzanne for your generosity and its really fresh new perspective on Picasso and his work. Our first question comes from David Koslow, and I will read it on their behalf. And the question is this. Can this painting be understood without imposing a narrative as an exercise in composition secondary to Picasso's practice in collage? And as a side note, they mentioned that he famously said that collage was the artwork of the 20th century, and that T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland writes that these fragments shore my ruins. So that's the question.
Do you want a one-word answer? No, of course. I mean, in a way, a physical collage is where you're cutting apart pieces is something quite different. But I see absolutely that his interest in this particular painting is using the same kind of vocabulary of the different styles that he's using, the different individuals, and in a sense that piecing together of things that may not usually be put together is a key part of what he's doing. And to answer that in a slightly different way, if you think about somebody like Romare Bearden and his great collages, and he owed something both to African art and to thinking about certainly people like Picasso. So I think it's a really great point that has just been made.
Thank you. Our next question comes from a Rail editor, Amanda Glubisi. I will pass you the mic now.
Great. Hi, thank you so much for this conversation. I've really appreciated it. And Suzanne, I love particularly your book about the Malian architecture. That is particularly dear to me. I really appreciated that you mentioned that you've written so much of your work without texts, which is something that I think that a lot of people don't realize about African art and art history. I'm currently reading The Golden Rhinoceros right now, which is so wonderful. And Francois Xavier Fauvel mentions actually that there's so little to turn to in terms of text. So how does art history talk to history in the pre-modern period? And is there a way to expand historians' horizons to object issues so that we can say more about those unwritten histories?
Wow, this is another 2 hours. Great point. And I will say I'm glad you brought up the Mali architecture. The topic of my next book is called 1325, How Medieval Africa Made the World Modern. And in it, I'm arguing that the mosque at Cordoba, among others, is deriving from sub-Saharan Africa. In this critical period, Africa really is informing a lot of what we know about Africa. To go behind your question, if I could, I think it's really important for historians to break the tie with text and to go back earlier. We all know that writing lies, people lie, you have to weed through it anyway, and try to take up things where there may not be written text. Early Africa is a case in point. My belief is that Africa in the medieval period was one of the greatest centers, certainly of learning and of knowledge and of trade and invention anywhere in the world. And just because we've got very little written about it doesn't mean we can't discover it. And that's where the artworks come in, or the architecture, or the way that one is creating a particular joint or forming earth to create a particular adobe structure. And you can look using not only your eyes, but science to really reveal what is happening beneath the surface. I'm using now DNA and graffiti and other things to try to figure out if there was a Christian mission in the middle of Nigeria in the 12th through 15th century. It frees one in a way. You don't have to spend those 150 pages identifying everybody else who's written about something beforehand. I mean, I had to deal a little bit with this with Picasso because so much has been written, and there may be 3 sentences in there where I say, I'm not doing this and I'm not doing that and I'm not doing this, but you can read these other sources. But I really hope that historians will take up art. I think, and I hope that they'll take it up not just as evidence, but as something which will actually help them form a new view of the way history functions, because as Coco can say, art lies as much as it tells the truth. And it's finding that kind of complexity, the ways in which artists enrich our understanding by pointing out what is not happening as much as what is, that makes it, I think, so revealing and so transformative.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda, for that question. Our next question comes from the audience, and I will read it on their behalf. And the question is this. Picasso contributed a drawing for the cover of the catalog printed for the first International Conference of Negro Writers and Artists held in Paris, 1956. Can you speak to the relationship between Picasso and the intellectuals of the Negritude movement?
Great question. And like so many others here, it's complex. The Negritude movement in part is coming out of Senegal, and we think Sangor among others. And there is a famous meeting between Sangor and Picasso in which he is said to have, Picasso is said to have said to Sangor, I'll say it in French and it translates easily, "Nous sommes tous les deux les sauvages," we're both savages. And purportedly, Sangor is said to have said back to Picasso, "Pas moi," not me. So there's a disconnect, I think, between the two. Of Picasso thinks he's doing something very radical and provocative in the face of what is happening in Europe. And I think that what is happening on the continent of Africa with negritude, et cetera, is a validation and a reinvention of Africa in new terms that are going to have more than a specific locality of importance in it. So in this case, it was the larger Francophone speaking world more generally. Now that's a colonial term, of course, because, you know, you're speaking French because French colonials were there. But there's a really interesting set of crosstalk and cross-currency between the two that I think is as important as it is for the negritude artists to turn to Picasso as somebody who really is a key hero for them because he validated African art. They're coming at it from two different junctures in a way. I think that that's equally interesting. The same way when Picasso gives his big sculpture to Chicago in the 1960s, that's really saying a lot from Picasso's standpoint about understanding of Chicago and its history as an African-American city. And then that gets kind of wrapped up in other kinds of issues. But that's what makes it fun to look at the history and the social background of the two of them.
I would just like to jump in there. This doesn't have to do with the connection to the negritude poets, but has to do with Picasso's friendship with Lam, who was Afro-Cuban Chinese, but very much identified with his African roots, and a lot of the mythology referred to in some of his paintings is based on Santeria, which is a syncretism of Yoruba and Catholic ideas. And Picasso is known to have expressed a lot of envy to Lam of Lam's being Black. Even though he probably, thought that his own artwork was better, he envied Lam's identity. So, there's that relationship. And also, I just wanted to point out that it is because of the reevaluation or the evaluation of African art as valuable, that when Alan Locke started advocating during the Harlem Renaissance for paying more attention to African-American artists, he was also telling African-American artists to pay more attention to African art because he had seen in visiting Paris what Picasso and his colleagues were doing with African art and saying about African art. So, I think that this, Picasso's influence is also in a way, and in an attenuated way, an extended way, on people from the Harlem Renaissance who then were starting to think in a less negative way about connecting with African art tradition and bringing it into African American art practice.
Exactly.
Aaron Douglas's murals, for example, the attempt to kind of negotiate with Africanness, comes out of the looking at what the Europeans were doing. That was Alan Locke's argument. He's like, hey, you guys, you know, how come they're white over there and they're doing it and we're black over here and we're not?
Yeah, yeah. And some of that was also imposing a particular set of styles that patrons might be wanting. But I was simply going to add to your point, which was, I'm so glad you brought up, Lamb, is that Picasso's cousin was black. He was Cuban. Mm-hmm. And he certainly would have known of this from the Spanish connection with Cuba. But I think that also is a kind of interesting one. I don't think that they ever met, but trying to, and he's from Malaga, which is a city right on the border where for centuries, African, sub-Saharan and North African troops and artists, blacksmiths, et cetera, were coming over into Spain. So his sort of longer legacy was within that broader cross-currency.
Super fascinating. Thank you. So our final question comes from the publisher, Fong Bui. Fong, you should be able to activate your mic.
Thank you. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Coco. This is so illuminating. That's another also question, another 2 hours between Lamb and Mata. And we can certainly continue with that. But I want to ask two short questions, Suzanne. One is that I know that you have left your second year at University of Vermont, right after when Martin Luther King was assassinated April 4th, and then in the same year, in June 6th, Robert Kennedy. So you decided to go to Africa, and that basically a lifelong commitment to what you do as a scholar. Can you share with us a little bit of that? Second question is super simple. It's following just something I've been recently look at, author Kingsley Porter, 3-volume, and particularly the fact that he had taught at Harvard, where you are now, who really tackle a lot of questions such as the nature of transmission of autistic influence, attribution, at the same time challenging the certain kind of current system of chronology and classification. But he also was one of the first who really advocate for the use of photography as an art historical tool. So how does that play in his contribution to the, you know, to the following practice of such? But so that anyway, if you can combine the two together, will be brilliant. Thank you so much.
Well, let me begin with your last question. It's absolutely true. I mean, it used to be in art history classes, the wealthy, art historians were wealthy, would bring the students to their home and show them the great paintings, or they would put things in their pocket and bring them from home to the class. This is before, I mean, museums are relatively modern creation. The Harvard Art Museum had only plaster casts into the early 20th century. So photography really was transformative for the whole teaching of art. And in much the same way with the book by Leo Frobenius, the photographs and the line drawings and the watercolors that so inspired Picasso, Frobenius happened to have a great eye. He could really tell masterpieces of African art. And he went around to every museum, really, in Europe where they had them. Twice he failed his exam to become a PhD, believe it or not, in Germany. Part of it was class. But he wrote these books, and those books became the canons for many people for what was important for museums to buy, because there were all of these photographs in it. So both the photographs that we use in classes and the photographs at books were transformative in terms of disseminating knowledge about a whole myriad of different things. To go back to my own history, after my freshman year, I was in Washington, D.C., working in the Senate as an intern. And it was a really hard summer there. There was a lot of rioting. There was tear gas most every night. And it was the summer that Bobby Kennedy was killed. And I was there living in a relatively inexpensive area of the town called DuPont Circle. You can laugh, it's just the opposite of that now. Living in a hostel for international youth. And I remember going out and seeing the hearse with his body go by. And I went back to school, and I was interested in art. I was interested in art history, but at that time, of course, it was the Vietnam War. There were a whole series of things, and I wanted to do something meaningful, and I just didn't think that art history could be that important, meaningful. So I went to Africa. I was doing something very different outside of art. I was in what is now the Republic of Benin and doing, digging wells and building schools and doing animal husbandry. And out of that, I began reading some books on African art, and I just was shocked. It was so pejorative. It was so appalling. The classic books, the Jansen. And I just said, I can't let this stand. And so I've come back, and I will say I believe that my work is very political, in the sense of I'm trying to recapture for a lay audience as much as an academic audience the profound importance of Africa and its civilization.
Well, thank you, Suzanne. Beautiful answer.
Thank you so much, Phong, and thank you so much, Suzanne and Coco, for your responses today. This has been a super fascinating conversation. So we have a tradition at the Rail of ending our lunches with a poem, and we've carried this tradition into these community events. And today I'm thrilled to welcome the poet Corrine Fitzpatrick to the stage. And before I pass the mic to her, I just want to quickly introduce Karine. Karine is a writer and educator. Her essays, poetry, and art criticism have been published in Triple Canopy, Bomb, The Rail, and many, many others. And she has also taught at School of the Art Institute of Chicago, Naropa University, and Columbia. And without further ado, I will pass you the mic. Welcome.
Hi, thank you, Catherine. Thank you so much, Coco and Suzanne. That was a terrific conversation, and I have a long syllabus for myself begun just in the past hour of your references. Thank you. I'm going to read a short poem written about a year ago, and then a newer medium-length poem written yesterday that I am trying to figure out how they're connected. All I can say is that I'm thinking a lot about whether or not language is evidence of thought or is a precursor for thought, thinking about my 10-month-old daughter and my 90-year-old grandmother who has Alzheimer's and aphasia. And so you'll hear that thinking happening in these poems. I lost it sounds wrong. It was lost, too passive, too hot in the sun. I was in Maine in totalizing ungodly pain. Mercifully, the July day was gorgeous. It was a long day waiting, evacuation, of conception. I want to be harmonious with all of your fates. My grandmother in Maine, a visit prior. Early spring, pre-thaw. Remediations of remediations create ever new declamatory gibberish. Thicket language grows. Volumes of worlds where said and unsaid gather. In Maine, I descend a thicket. Winter dims the forest green a touch. My grandmother asks, am I alive? Thinking rejects magic with what reason? And this is the one from yesterday, so bear with me. The Rememberer. 1. In the absence of form, the want of constraint, language lacks and updates. Action slides onto a word. People to whom things happen. Context slips from a word I no longer know. I am trying to say, hold an image in your mind and describe it. Describe the conditions surrounding the hold. 2. The news of the killing of the son of the judge in New Jersey is a page from the parable of the sower, which I am reading only now. Seeds of the earth seed walk the 118 to the 23 south, 101 west, north. I know those hills, shoulders, rocks, overpass, mountains, coast. As a child, I dreamt over and over of watching my family be dismembered, the street from the house a screen, this book, 1993. Post-riots context of the novel's release still smoldering. Book and news, nightmares of the day, our baby in her crib, vulnerable, and the vulnerability of my love. In this second half of the first year of Ilona, pandemic, federal agents in Portland spreading like the sickness, soon Chicago, Baltimore, Detroit, New York City, Oakland. Another map is Tulsa, Miami, Houston, Los Angeles, Salt Lake City, Topeka. In Louisville, protests for Breonna Taylor continue. In Portland, Mothers March. In Martinez, Catskill, elsewhere, not in my town. The keys are sticking, the monitor hums. Hannah texts news of the baby, born early, now home. Salvador means savior. 3. Season of squash and kale, plum flesh fed to the baby, plum leather peeled back like bark, marigold floating in a jug for pastis from eBay, from France, pale orange blossoms, sticky rough basil and broccoli ropes, aloe, galactic home to rodents, birds, lizards, bugs, poppies in the wood mulch, tomato buds, almost pears, stone fruit never more than stone. Ilona now sees flying birds, a small one on top of the redwood. She waved like she waves at the leaves through the windows, at all sources of light, to be greeted, fellow feeling, what is alive? Her 10-month-old finger traces flowers in a book, her mouth on images, words, which are images of words. 2-part sequences, a page and its turn, a grasp then a climb, shake for a sound, a dog in his bed. Somehow, I have David Trinidad's copy of Handbook of Poetic Forms. I understand the world through people, I know. Thanks. Thank you again for having me and for your wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much, Karine. That was beautiful. And thank you again, Coco and Suzanne and everyone who else came out today. This was really fascinating. Great for the art history nerds out there. Please join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with the artists and curators of 2 amazing exhibitions on the history of incarceration in Louisiana. Tomorrow at 1 p.m., same link, same time, please join us. And you should all be able to activate your mics now if you'd like to say goodbye as you leave.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Coco.
Suzanne.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Coco.
Thanks, Suzanne. Thanks,
Thanks,
Coco.
Karine.